That's the tricky part, I think, with regards to, say, post-traumatic stress disorder or regret. Because it's one thing if you're sad because you've lost people. It's another thing if you're blaming yourself because you believe, and maybe with some cause, that you've made a mistake. And often people don't know what to do about the fact that they've made a mistake. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit, because some of the people who are watching and listening will have made mistakes, and some of them are hanging themselves out to dry because of it, right? I mean, especially if you make mistakes that have had fairly dramatic consequences. So, and this ties in, I would say, also to the motif of forgiveness, because there's not much difference between forgiving other people and forgiving yourself. And you can't just do that by saying that you're going to do it. So what I've observed clinically, and I think this works philosophically as well, is that what you want to do to set things right, which is to atone, is to lay out what you've done that you think was wrong. Provide yourself with the best possible defense. So, there's a reason in our legal system that we start with the presumption of innocence, which is a miracle. Because like tyrannies start with the presumption of guilt. And the reason they do that is because everyone's done something wrong. And if you dig around enough in anyone's life, you'll find a reason that they're culpable, a reason to put them away. And so the fact that we presume innocence is a complete bloody miracle. And I can't figure out how we ever managed to get that right. But you got to do that with yourself. So imagine you're taking yourself to task because you did some things wrong. It's like, okay, list them out in your imagination or write it down. But then you got to defend yourself as thoroughly as you possibly can, which doesn't mean you're trying to get yourself off the hook. It means that you're trying not to take yourself apart more than is necessary. And then you might ask, well, if I've done something terrible, maybe what's necessary is that I commit suicide, is that like I pay the ultimate price for my sins. And people will do that when they're depressed. And that's not right, because actually what you want to do to atone is to set yourself back on the right track. So the precondition for forgiving yourself is, first of all, to sort out whether or not you're accusing yourself too viciously, like a tyrant. But then let's assume that there's some leftover evidence, compelling evidence that you did do something wrong. Okay, now you have to figure out what you did wrong, and you have to figure out what you would have done differently and what you will do differently in the future. And then my sense is, and I think this works out psychologically, is that if you can set yourself up so that you've learned from the mistake you made so you wouldn't repeat it, then you get to go on with your life. And I think that's also what you do with people around you. I mean, you might want to forgive someone maybe who hurt you when you were young, for example, because you don't want to carry that burden around. It's like, it's been 20 years, you're still mad about it. It's like, well, you got tortured, plus you're still angry about it, so that's not good for you. But to forgive someone so that you can heal a relationship means that they have to confess what they did, they have to assess why it was wrong, they have to come up with an alternative way of behaving, and then they have to swear, by all that's holy, so to speak, that they're not going to do that again in the future. And then I think, and you might say, that the devil in your mind that's still accusing you might say, well, what you did is so terrible that you should never be let off the hook. And I would say to that is that if that's the criteria that you use for judgment, then everyone's doomed, because everyone makes mistakes in their lives. And I would say probably everybody makes unforgivable mistakes. And so if we're going to take ourselves apart about that permanently, then we're all ruined.
Yeah, I was pretty lucky growing up in the military that I would get to see guys, and I was probably 26 years old, and I moved into like an instructor role in the SEAL teams. And so you'd see these young leaders, and they go out on some training mission, and they were going to mess things up. They're going to make mistakes. And you always get this talk about, well, you made the best decision you could with the information that you had at the time. And it kind of sounds like a cop-out in a way, but it's actually not a cop-out at all. You make the best decision that you can with the information that you have at the time. Like, what more can a human being do than make the best decision they can with the information that they had at the time? And when you get more information, or when the results come as they may, that decision that you made might not have been a good decision. It might have been a bad decision. But there's number one, there's nothing you can do to change it. Like, it already happened. You made the decision. And then I would always look at the guys and say, what was their intent behind this decision that they made? Like, why did they do that? Because if we can decipher that, and their intent was they wanted to make a good move to get their guys out of a bad situation, what more could I want from a leader than to make a decision that's doing their best with the information that they had at the time to maneuver out of a bad scenario to take care of their guys? There's nothing more I could hope for. So as long as I think you peel back the onion and you kind of review what happened, you say, oh yeah, I made the decision at this time. Of course, if I had this other information, I change it, but I did what I did. The result was not what I wanted. It's not what I intended. Here we are. And now you can either beat yourself up or you can say, here's some lessons I've learned from it. And you know, the first book that I wrote was called Extreme Ownership. The opening chapter of that was a fratricide that took place where I was the guy in charge, where one of my SEALs killed a friendly Iraqi soldier in a terrible situation. And of course, you know, we could go back and the hindsight's 20/20 and I could have done this and I should have done this and I should have done something else. And I didn't. And that's on me. And so I think, you know, that initial part, if we're going to talk about forgiveness, the first part of that is taking ownership to say, yep, this was my call. This was my decision. This is the move that I made. That's me. It's not anybody else, it's me. Because the minute you start saying, well, this person did that and this person's, you know, the enemy did this and we didn't expect that. The minute you start casting blame on other people, now I think you're lying to yourself. And I think that's going to cause more problems. So saying, yes, this was a decision I made. This was the information I had at the time. It ended up being a bad decision. Here was my intent behind it. And I've got to move forward. If you want to, you know, I always talk about you want to learn, but you don't want to dwell. If you dwell on the past, if you dwell on the mistakes that you made, like you said, everybody is just doomed.
Well, so the tricky issue there, I think, is that people who are taking themselves apart, they're often conscientious people. And so, well, they'll assume that taking ownership in your terms means raking yourself over the coals. And the crucial thing to establish there is like, well, yeah, you have to rake yourself over the coals until you learn, but no more than that, because after that it's counterproductive. Is what you're trying to foster is improvement, right? Now, and then in terms of making a case for your innocence, that's where analysis of ignorance is useful. You know, you said, well, and it's a question of conscience. Did you make the best use of the information that you had available at the time? And one answer is, well, yes, but I had sparse information. And then you have to ask yourself, well, could have you been more informed if your eyes would have been more open? That's a willful blindness issue. But it's definitely worthwhile to, when you're making a case to defend yourself, to see how much of the sequence of events that resulted in the unfortunate conclusion was attributable to situation. There's a classic mistake in thinking that people make called the fundamental attribution error. So imagine that you're driving along on the road and somebody cuts you off and you say, well, that son of a bitch. It's like, and then, you know, you find 2 blocks later that you're in the same situation in terms of the positioning of the automobiles and you cut someone else off. And it's harder to do a situational analysis than to do a personal attribution. And so people will default to a personal attribution, that son of a bitch. And that can turn around to bite you because it's difficult when you're retroactively assessing something you've done to take into account all the situational factors. But that is definitely something you do if you're mounting a defense for yourself. And that's part of that presumption of innocence. So we could say, if you're trying to get yourself out of something like post-traumatic stress disorder, we would say, well, how would you make the case for yourself if you began with the presumption of innocence and that there were situational factors? Make the strongest possible case. So you do that. Now, if there's some residual issues that you have to contend with, like the fact that you were willfully blind, or, you know, maybe you weren't protecting your men, maybe you were going for the promotion because you're more ambitious than you should be, like that speaks to intent. But you shouldn't convict yourself until all the arguments that are in favor of your innocence have exhausted themselves.